Good morning, students. Today we will be discussing the topic on joints. Now, what is a joint? A joint is actually a point where two or more bones are joined together for the purpose of movement or articulation. And we can move our body parts, we can move our body. This is actually possible only because of joints in our body. Now, at the joints, the bones are held together. As you can see in this diagram, that the bones are held together by bands of flexible connective tissue, and these bands are called ligaments. Ligaments keep the bones in position. It is very visible, clear in this diagram that ligaments are joining two bones. Then the muscles are attached to the ends of the bones by another kind of connective tissue which is fibrous in nature, and these are called tendons. So you can see that tendons join the muscles to the bone in this figure. Besides this, the ends of the bone are covered with soft connective tissue, that is cartilage, which is shown by a pink color in the diagram. You can see that the end of bones are joined by soft cartilage, and this cartilage acts as a cushion between the bones and prevents them from rubbing against each other, and it reduces friction between the bones and also absorbs the shocks. So these cartilage pads act as a cushion, prevent friction, reduce friction and absorb the shocks between the bones. The cartilage pads are present between the vertebrae and at the end of long bones also. So this figure shows you ligaments that join the two bones, tendons that attach muscles to the bones, and cartilage that are present at the end of two different bones which act as a cushion between the bones. Now we come to the different types of joints. The joints have basically been classified into three major kinds, and these major kinds of joints are based on the degree of freedom of movement. So based on that, we have three different kinds of joints. First are the immovable joints, which are also called the fixed joints because the bones are joined together and they form a basically that joint is seen in the form of a suture because these are fixed joints, and these joints are found between the skull bones, and the bones of an immovable joint, they form a single protective covering. Then the second kind of joints are the partially movable joints. Partially means they are slightly movable in nature and they only allow a slight movement of bones. And examples of such joints are the joints between the ribs and the sternum, and joints between the bones of two different vertebrae in the vertebral column. Slightly movable joints. Then the third category of joints are the freely movable joints. These joints basically are joints where one bone moves freely on the other bone, and most of these freely movable joints are the synovial joints. The synovial joints are joints, we will be studying about the synovial joints in detail, but examples of these freely movable joints are the shoulder joints, the hip joint, the knee joint, the elbow joint, and the other joints like joint between the bones of the wrist, that is the carpals, and joint between the bones of the ankle, that is the joint between the tarsals. Now, freely movable joints have been further divided into 5 major kinds, and these are the pivot joint, the gliding joint, the hinge joint, the saddle joint, and the ball and socket joint. We will be discussing each of these 5 joints a little later. Now we come to the structure of a synovial joint, which is actually kind of a freely movable joint. Synovial joints are joints where one bone moves freely on the other. And as I said, the freely movable joints like the shoulder joint, the knee joint, the hip joint, and the elbow joint are kind of synovial joints. These joints allow considerable degree of movement, and basically these joints have 2 special requirements. The first requirement is that they should be held firmly in position, and the second requirement is that the surfaces that are coming in contact with each other should be well lubricated to remove friction, and the lubricating fluid is called the synovial fluid, and because of which the joint is named is called synovial joint. And the knee joint is a good example of synovial joint. Now this figure shows you how 2 bones are in contact with each other, and there is a synovial cavity which is filled with synovial fluid, which is the lubricating fluid, and it prevents friction. So here you can see a diagrammatic representation of the synovial joint of the knee joint, which is, as I said, is a very good example of synovial joints. Now you can see that in this joint the end of the articulating bones are covered by a thin layer of cartilage, and the entire joint is enclosed within a tough synovial capsule, and the wall of the capsule is formed of an outer dense fibrous layer and a less denser cellular inner synovial layer, and the cavity of the capsule between the articulating bones is called the synovial cavity, which is filled with the lubricating fluid called synovial fluid. And as I told you, because of this synovial fluid, the joint is called synovial joint. And synovial joint permits considerable degree of movement between the articulating bones without friction. They are further reinforced by strong and elastic ligaments outside the synovial capsule, and these ligaments help in bringing the articulating bones back to their normal position after the movement. That is why bones articulated by synovial joints have sufficient freedom of movement. Now these two figures, this is a general figure of a synovial joint, and this is a diagrammatic representation of the knee joint, where you can see the femur and the tibia. Two bones are in contact with each other. Synovial fluid is present in the synovial capsule, and how it is lined by synovial membrane, and the ends of the two bones are covered by a thin layer of cartilage. So now we come to the other types of freely movable joints. Now, on the basis of the presence or absence of the synovial capsule and ligaments, the freely movable joints may be perfect joints or they may be imperfect joints. Now, the perfect joints, in these kinds of joints, the articulating bones are enclosed within synovial capsule, which is supported by elastic ligaments from outside. Whereas in imperfect joints, the ligaments and synovial capsule are absent. The cartilage tipped ends of the bones articulate directly. And we will now be discussing the 5 different kinds of movable joints which I had named a little while ago. The pivot joint, after the pivot, gliding joint, then hinge joint, then saddle joint, and ball and socket joint. We will be discussing each of these 5 joints one by one. So we begin with the pivot joint. Now in the pivot joint, one bone can rotate on the rounded or the conical surface of the other bone in many planes. That is, it can move up and down, and it can move side to side. An example of this joint is the joint between the skull and the first vertebra, which is called atlas of the backbone. And such a joint is also present between the first and the second vertebra, that is atlas and axis. And it is shown here in the diagram how there is movement in the pivot joint. Then we come to the next joint, that is the gliding joint. In a gliding joint, the two bones can slide upon each other. These joints allow sideways as well as forward and backward movement. Example, joints between the wrist bones, that is the carpals, and the joint between the bones of the ankle, that is the tarsals, are examples of gliding joints. Then the third kind of joint, you can see the figure shows you gliding joint between bones of the forearm and the wrist bones. Then the third joint, the hinge joint. In this joint, a protuberance or a condyle at the end of one bone fits into a corresponding depression so that the bone with the condyle can be swung like a door on its hinge only in one direction and up to 180 degrees. In a hinge joint, the bone with condyle can be swung like a door on its hinge only in one direction and only up to 180 degrees. Examples of hinge joint are the elbow joint between the upper arm, that is the humerus, and the forearm, that is the bones of the forearm, which is mainly the radius and ulna bones. And besides this, the knee joint is also an example of a hinge joint, the joint that is formed between the thigh bone, the femur, and the lower leg, that is the tibia and fibula of the lower leg forms the hinge joint. Then the next kind of joint, the fourth kind of joint, is the saddle joint. Now, saddle joint is an imperfect ball and socket joint in which one bone is movable on the other bone, which is fixed in many joints. And this figure shows you the saddle joint, example of which is the thumb joint, and the joint between the first metacarpal and the carpal. Then the last or the fifth kind of joint is the ball and socket joint. As the name itself clearly tells us that a ball which is a rounded end of one bone appears like a ball, it fits into a socket. That is, it fits into a depression or a cavity of the other bone, and the bone with ball-like head is freely movable in all directions. An example of this is the shoulder joint, where the head of the humerus bone fits into the cavity, into the depression of cavity which is called the glenoid cavity of the pectoral girdle at the shoulders. And another example is the hip joint, where the head of the femur bone fits in the cavity acetabulum of the pelvic girdle or the hip girdle, and this is how ball and socket joint is formed. And this figure shows you how the head of the bone fits in the depression in the cavity and helps in movement of the joint. So these were the different kinds of joints that we have discussed today. The three major kinds of joints: immovable joints or fixed joints, partially movable or slightly movable joints, freely movable joints, and then the 5 subcategories of the freely movable joints in detail with examples. And I will end today's class here. And this is a request to all of you that you be serious regarding your studies. Your unit tests will begin from the 1st of December, and we have already told you about the syllabus. But besides doing these 3 chapters which are there in your unit test syllabus, you have to keep revising the other chapters also, all the other topics that have been taught to you, because in your final exam the entire syllabus is in course. Syllabus prescribed by the council will be taken into consideration while making your final paper. So keep revising whatever has been taught till you. Make your notes, practice the figures, the diagrams, and be well prepared. So good luck. Till next time, stay safe and stay healthy.